So this gospel reading is what is a sign today when we celebrate Christ the King. Our liturgical colors have changed from what we call ordinary time, or the ordinal of the liturgical calendar, from green, and now here on the celebration of Christ the King, we have this kind of wonderful set of royal colors of red that just touches on the idea that Christ's sovereignty was a sacrificial one, but also this kind of gold thread that is shot through. We only get gold thread and gold ornaments or parlements when you're talking about times when we want to elevate Jesus' royal nature, his kingship. And so all of these ideas, sacrifice, kingship, the way that nobility is also integrated with humility, all of these things come to us in the celebration of Christ the King. Now, the other part of that is, for us, in a church year, Christ the King ends our church year, right? It is the final thing that happens before we start a new year, or new liturgical year, with Advent next week. On that day, our whole liturgical calendar turns again, and in fact, we get a whole new set of readings and a whole new year of readings and start from fresh again. So here, the very last lesson that is imparted to us in this year, everything's been leading up to this kingship of Christ. And yet, in so many ways, it's very, very different from what the early community of Christians thought that a king would be like. The kingship of the Hebrew Messiah was painted very differently. The Messiah as king was going to come and vanquish all foes. And in the understanding of the day, they thought vanquish all foes looked like a final war. And Jesus spends his last lessons trying to educate his apostles, his followers, that in fact, if you want to achieve might, then the very thing you're going to do is lay down your arms. If you want to be close to God, the very thing that you're going to do is be vulnerable. If you want to know peace in your land, the very thing you're going to do is set aside violence of act and word and heart and be something different. In fact, the whole notion of the kingdom, the whole notion of the king, takes on a very important turn in his last lessons, even in the Garden of Gethsemane. We have this moment when Jesus and the others are confronted with the guards and a sword is drawn, and Jesus says, no. Could he, as the Son of God, done all manner of violence? Sure. But was that ever God's message? No. Was it ever what people wanted? Yes. Even today, we are in the midst of experiencing again this thought that rule and governance and power look like violence. And yet, there is not a more shallow understanding and exercise of will than that. Violence of any kind, from our daily experiences of bullying or racism or exclusion, for whatever reason, is a violence to our very hearts and souls. And we know that it does hurt. Much more than does it hurt when humanity rises up against itself and proclaims that it will, some person or other, will take over a country, some land, through an ideology or a set of thoughts that does those very pieces of violence: exclusion, alienation, racism, intolerance of all kinds. In the midst of this, God sends us a very unlikely image of Cain. Rather than someone followed by armies and followers who are equipped with all manner of weaponry, Jesus is sent to us as a king who is, at the end, ultimately rejected, abhorred, he's mocked, he's whipped, he's beaten in front of everybody. He's bloody, and finally, he's taken and crucified for sedition. Specifically, crucifixion as punishment for those who have done things against the state. What in the world has he done? But the most threatening thing possible, far more powerful than any weapon and any violence we would ever achieve. And that threat is to give people a reason for setting that aside. What greater threat to despotic power than to refuse to play the game? Than to say, we will not contribute to violence in thought or word or deed. We will always strive in every way we can to bring the nature of the kingship of Christ, not of men or people, but the kingship of Christ, which gives us this example of an ultimately vulnerable God. That true royalty and sovereignty looks like that kind of dedication to love and relationship. Now, I don't know if any of you watched The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. Anybody watch that? We got some confessors. Yes. Now, I really enjoy the variety of speakers that he's had on so far in the show. And just this past week, he had on two people that couldn't have been more different. In one show, he had on, Bill Maher, right? You can't find a more cynical kind of guy than Bill Maher. Now, I he has some good political insight, don't get me wrong. But the thing that seemed to astonish Stephen Colbert so much was their talk got to the place of religion. And this is where a lot of our society is going with this conversation, which is people who believe bad things in the name of religion means that religion is bad. What? Could it possibly mean that the people who are perverting the belief system might be doing that for a less than good intention? And perhaps the true faith behind it is not what is bad, but the perversion of it sure is. In any faith, that can happen through a radicalization of thought process. And yet, Bill Maher went there, didn't he? In his talk, he went toward saying, well, Stephen, who is a Catholic, he says to him, well, I suppose if you think religion could be helpful at all, myself, though, I don't particularly believe in a Bronze Age fairy tale. Now, part of me would be shocked by that if I hadn't been raised by atheists myself. Now, both my parents were atheists for different reasons, and both my brothers still are. You know, as adults, they still are. And I certainly said a lot of the things that were taught to me from my parents in terms of the critique against the foolishness of Christianity, the utter psychological wacko stuff, right? In a God that was unconditionally loving. The reason that they really critiqued Christianity was for the same reason that it's happening now, and all religion under criticism. Because those who have not wielded it well have utterly made a name for all religion as being a violent piece of rhetoric, as though God walks around with a giant cosmological cudgel to say, I love you. That is messed up. And if you're taught that, you're going to be messed up. And there's many times I have in my office people who are trying to heal from really damaging experiences in churches. or from parents, from communities that did less than accept them for who they are, that did less than asking them to love themselves as unconditionally as God, that utterly failed in building them up as people, that completely failed to give them the spiritual strength and equipment they needed to in fact stand in the face of that kind of tyranny and say, that is not what Christ has taught. It is not. It is not what God has ever taught by whatever name we call that God. The only sacrifice asked for us is a contrite and humble heart, to actually revel and dwell and live from that place of us which is vulnerable, to not respond or react to violence into that spiral of ever greater violence, but rather to say, I will not. I will not. I believe what I believe, and you can, but at the end of the day, what is more powerful than any of that is our ability to love one another. To love one another as it is manifested to us through Christ, who models a kingship in that very vulnerability. The second person that was on this week in Stephen Colbert was Michael Caine. Those of you who may remember Michael Caine, a great actor, British actor, was also in some wonderful films. And he was 6 years old during the time in London when it was bombed on by Germany during World War II. And he and his mother and his other sibling, I can't remember, sister or brother, were taken to the country, as were many who were in the urban environment, to be safe, because London was a great target. And Stephen asked Michael Caine, what was the most frightening thing for you? And he said, well, even as a 6-year-old, I knew that when we heard the buzz bombs, you'd hear this really piercing sound, that they were coming. You knew they were coming, and you knew they were close, and you knew they might hit you. And Stephen said, well, what did you do? He goes, well, there's nothing to do. You could run around like a chicken with your head cut off. If it hit you or not, you just stayed where you were and kept eating your porridge. But eventually, they were relocated to a safer location, as were many. And in that, it was amazing that Michael Caine just sort of said, about what's going on in Paris. The most powerful thing people can do, and the Parisians are doing, is to come together in peace, with a refusal to reject Syrian refugees, with an absolute dedication to living life fully, and to not being intimidated to what is truly terrifying. The belief that they are not free, because they are. And that freedom, that kind of freedom, is extremely scary to people who would like us to be afraid. Living life fully. Now, as I began to do research for this sermon today, I came across a very powerful sermon written during World War II by a preacher named William Sangster, who's Methodist. And in fact, the church in which he was preaching was bombed repeatedly, and sometimes on a Sunday morning while he was preaching. And at one point, during a bombing, as he's going away, he paused in the sermon and said, those of you of a more nervous condition may leave at this time. What grace. I wonder how many people got up and said, he spent most of World War II living in a bomb shelter underneath the church. And yet he would stay in the pulpit during all these kinds of raids, including the raids on his own town, without moving. And I wanted to share with you a small section of his sermon called, What If Calamity Comes? Here we have the stories of the King, the Messiah, and the arrival of the Messiah associated with the end times, as though the end had to happen before the Messiah comes. which is a completely incorrect reading. Let me say that to you if no one said that to you. Revelations is not about things have to all be destroyed before he comes. It is about he comes so that all the violence will end. And in the midst of that, he can only come when we end the violence. But here's a quote from William Sangster's sermon. Turning on Peter, Jesus ordered the sword back into its sheath and broke their last hope of a spectacular conquest. He would not agree to force. He has taken the longer way, the way of love, and no pain would turn him back. Never had his Father broken the rule of the ages and bludgeoned his way into the unwilling hearts of men. Jesus would not ask him now to do anything different. Jesus would conquer sin with love. He would make the cross a throne. He would use the shame and pain and humiliation of it to expose the very heart of God. And sin would not triumph. It would be but a dark background, by contrast, revealing the wonder of God's love. And so he takes the cross not out of compulsion, not because he is merely submissive or resigned, but willingly and of free choice. The gift of free choice is the greatest bugbear and greatest grace that God has given to us. We cannot have the right to wail to the heavens, why is this happening to us? Why is any travail in our lives ever happening to us? It must be God's fault. We have free will. And when we use that gift rightly, we can show one another a different route. And we can choose a different way. Not being the victims of choices, but owning that cross. Deciding how we will live through times that we have now, that are based in such a variety of human choice. We have a choice every day to say, will we do as Christ did? Because here's the thing, the final thought. We know that we have been baptized into Christ's death. We know that we've been baptized into his resurrection. We know that we've been baptized into his ministry. But we have also been baptized into his kingship. Now the version, the translation that we heard this Revelations from is the New Revised Standard. But here is the true Greek translation of this one sentence. To him who loves us and freed us from sins by his blood, and made us to be not a kingdom, but made us to be kings, priests serving his God and Father. We have been made to be kings, to be queens, to be royalty on earth, in a kingdom that is not someplace mystically in the future or someplace mystically in some transcendent heaven. The heaven is kingdom on earth. It is now. You are kings and queens now. You must bring that royalty now. You must be committed to peace, committed to God's love and grace and passion and mercy. We must. Because the kingdom is ushered in, not with some flaming sword, but with a humble heart that says love. In Christ's name, let us speak that most powerful word.